So sexual shame is a visceral feeling in my body because it didn't come in cognitively. My left brain, my language brain wasn't even online yet. Into my body, visceral feeling of humiliation and disgust toward one's own body and identity as a sexual being, and a belief of being inferior, unworthy, and abnormal. This feeling can be internalized. In fact, that's where it begins, internalized, but it also manifests in interpersonal relationship.
Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Dr. Shafer of Talks with Dr. Shafer. I'm a physician, mom, life coach, musician, author, publisher, and I'm passionate about using storytelling as a tool to help you reclaim your story and build your most beautiful future. Thank you so much for joining me on today's guest episode. It's a really exciting and informative discussion we have in store for you. I am so happy to have our guest, Dr. Tina Schermer Sellers, a licensed sex and gender feminist psychotherapist, best-selling author, researcher, emeriti professor, and media personality whose expertise spans sex therapy, spiritual intimacy, parenting, and social justice. Her book, titled Shameless Parenting, is incredible, and it's centered around raising shame-free and confident kids and helping readers address their own relationship with shame as well. Today, I would love to invite you to this discussion about the concepts of shame, as well as shame and sexuality, and how we as parents can learn to parent without shame and prepare our kids for living life fully, including as a sexual being, by helping them become educated about their bodies and sexuality in safe and helpful ways to prepare them for life free of shame. Dr. Tina, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Shafer. I am so excited to be here with you and to have this conversation.
I am so excited to share this with people. And I encourage everyone after this conversation, go and listen to every conversation you've ever had, because, you, as we laid out in the introduction, you have looked into shame and our sexual lives from so many different perspectives, and they're all so important. So definitely everyone go and listen to those and read the books. They're incredible tools to have in your toolbox of how to address these really tough conversations with our kids, as well as do that healing for our own education, our own experience with shame, and our own sexuality. So I appreciate having you here to discuss what for a lot of families is a tough topic, but it's something that affects us all at the end of the day, and we would all benefit from education on. What inspired you to work in this field and to spend your life helping others understand their sexuality and form healthy sexual and interpersonal relationships?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I think I even say on my website, because I was thinking about this question one day, like I never set out to do this, but I think I've always been crafted to do it. So it's really a combo of, I grew up in a Swedish immigrant home. So my parents, grandparents, great aunts and uncles, they had generations of sex positive lives and conversations. And I was well into my 30s before I realized I was the one that grew up in the weird family, but I actually thought all families were like this. And so questions about the age appropriate questions and conversations around bodies and sexualities and relationships and happiness and how attachment and giving love and receiving love, all that stuff. It happened all the time. It happened as often as we talked about recipes or whatever. And I had conversations with every family member. And it was always just a sort of matter of fact, brief, sometimes a laugh, sometimes, giggly, sometimes serious, always really appropriate conversation throughout my life. And so unbeknownst to me, understanding bodies and sexuality and attachment and relationships and friendships and how you do them and all that was a common and easy conversation and a way of knowing about the world that for me was never set apart as something that you talk about once or in an uncomfortable conversation. It just wasn't my experience. But my first job was teaching junior high. And I was a junior high science teacher. And my kids wanted to know about sexuality. And I was teaching at a private school. So I told my administrator, I would really like to do a unit on sexuality and to answer the questions that these kids have and equip them to sort of know the difference between what is advertisement out there, what is media out there, and what is actual, what is true. And he's like, great, do this. And so I did. And it was so fun, to answer their questions or to say, gosh, that's a great question. I don't really even know how to answer that. Let me go do some research and I'll get back to you. And we did this like every Friday through like half the year or whatever. Super fun. Well, fast forward many years, I'd gone back to school, got a degree in marriage and family therapy, and then was hired at the graduate school that I had just graduated from. And one of the courses they needed to be taught was the human sexuality course for people that were going to be licensed therapists. It was a required course in the state of Washington where I lived at the time. And so I'm like, oh, great. That sounds fun. I can teach that. And so I put the course together. I had done one similar when I was in grad school and started teaching it. Well, one of the assignments I had my students do was to write their sexual autobiography. Now, people hear that and they're like, are you kidding? I can't even imagine committing my own story to paper and somebody else reading it. But I would say to my students, I did this when I took the course. I'm having you do it, not because I necessarily care what your story looks like, but I want you to know your story in narrative form. I want it to have a beginning, middle, and end. And the reason I want that is you're only ever as good a therapist as you know where your stories begin and end and your clients' stories begin and end, and you don't get those confused. That's why I'm going to ask you to put it to paper, because if you're like most people, they know aspects like, oh, I can remember the first time I got in trouble, or I can remember the first time I had a kiss, or I can remember this. And so it's pieces, but it's not a narrative. And so I'm going to give you like 70 questions and I'm going to ask you to think through your story. Not that you need to answer every question, but you'll see there's an arc to my questions. I want you to write that arc. And so these papers would be anywhere from 10 to 30 pages long. And I would spend anywhere from a half an hour to an hour and a half reading them. And I started teaching this course in 1992. And right around the year 2000, I started to notice that there was a significant shift in the tone of these stories. They started to have so much more self-condemnation, self-hatred, a sense that they were perverted, even though the story arc hadn't changed that much. People were telling relatively similar stories, right? So I thought, what am I seeing? Why is this like increase in ignorance about what normal curiosity and normal development is? Where's that coming from? And where's this self-condemnation coming from? It took me about 3 years to figure out what I was seeing. And what I realized I was seeing was the first wave of kids that had gone through school, gone through their adolescence with abstinence only education as the primary form of education in the US as far as bodies and sexuality goes. We had withdrawn in 1980 the sex education that we had had since 1947. It's pretty similar. We withdrew that and we inputted abstinence education, which was religious education at the public school level that we now know was 80% medically inaccurate, and it was fear-based. It was this idea that sex is dangerous and it'll kill you or ruin your life. Hard stop. And so whether kids came from religious homes or communities or not, they were getting this. And this was how it was manifesting with these 20-somethings to 30-somethings who had been exposed to this as they were growing up. It kind of peaked around the early 90s and then kind of remained in our culture very much until Barack Obama actually was withdrawing some of that and reinstating sexual health research again, because we'd withdrawn that as well from culture. And so it's what I was seeing was the impact of abstinence education on people's lives. They were afraid. They had had horrible experiences. They had been taught primarily from media and nothing except for don't from their homes and their relatives and their communities and their churches. And it had manifested in a lot of sexual dysfunction and a lot of fear and a lot of self-condemnation. They thought of themselves as perverted. And I would just spend all this time writing in the margins of these papers like, oh, sweetheart, you were so normal. That is a typical curiosity to have at that age. I'm so sorry no one was there to tell you that and to give you some instruction about what you needed. And it literally broke my heart, in part because of the contrast of the experience I had had, that bodies are normal, bodies love to connect. We are born for connection and pleasure. That's what we do the minute we come out of the womb. And you will see it if you walk into Alzheimer's units. Humans love connection and sharing pleasure. And that's what good sexuality is. It's connecting and it's pleasurable. And it was heartbreaking to me. And I thought, does anybody know that we've been doing this to kids? Does anybody know this? And I just started doing a deep dive and doing research and writing about it and speaking about it and saying, we have to stop this. We are hurting people's ability to actually attach and do love and connection and bonding, the things that we really are at the core of our happiness. That's where we were hurting people. And I just became kind of incensed about it.
And how does that reflect on an American lens versus what else was going around the world? And how could that also reflect on things that are going on now? I was of that age that was going through my education with the people you were teaching at that time. And those people continue to grow and have life experiences. They have their own marriages. They become victims of domestic violence, or they become perpetrators of domestic violence due to ideas about sex and relationships and shame. So looking back from your point of view, having researched this American policy in education, sex education, is it the same worldwide, or are there stark differences like you saw in your family compared to other families?
Yeah, I would say your most patriarchal and authoritarian countries are countries that are shutting down sexuality, sexual knowledge, body knowledge, empowerment, these kinds of things. Our Northern European countries are Holland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland. They've had comprehensive sex education since the 1940s. And they are age appropriate. And they don't call it sex education. They usually call it life education because they're teaching about emotional intelligence, relational intelligence, sexual intelligence. And they're also teaching about egalitarian, like gender roles and what that looks like in a society and how you affirm people's happiness and well-being. So there's particular education that happens in kindergarten and then in first grade and then second grade and all the way up through 12th grade. And it becomes increasingly more complex as kids grow and their questions become more complex. And they're given what they need to contrast actual human healthy relationships with what they might be selling in their economy. In the US, we became increasingly more authoritarian beginning in the 1980s. The religious right and the moral majority were sort of scooped up to put forward an idea of family values, which really behind family values was just removing the protective measures that were in culture to protect our society. So we got rid of the regulations in the FCC, the Federal Communication Commission. Now we could put anything we wanted to on TV, and we no longer had to follow journalistic ethics. We could say whatever was going to make money for our particular stockholders. So if you preach to a conservative population, you could say what was ever going to rile them up. A liberal population say whatever was going to rile them up. It did not have to have any measure of truth in it at all. It simply had to sell that agenda to that population. Americans, without realizing it, became advertising agenda. We became an advertising agenda for what was on TV. But it was all about making money for the stockholders. And cable TV came up to do the same exact thing. And people didn't know, because they didn't have media literacy. They didn't know, oh, I need to think about, is this accurate? Who is it serving? Who's it not serving? Who's it including? Who's it excluding? Who's it benefiting? Who's it not benefiting? We didn't know to ask those questions. And so people took it hook, line, and sinker. It served corporate growth. Later, we passed Citizens United, so now we could buy our politicians. So we've been growing in this way since 1980, when we began removing these regulations on banks and on the FCC and other places to protect our public. It became the most important ethic in the United States became make money for your corporations and your investors. It is exactly what has happened to get us where we are now. And this was always going to be the end result, because the people that were most pushing this, their own ethics were about their own greed and not about the welfare of our public life, our citizenry, and we have made this bed and now we're in it. And it's heartbreaking, of course, heartbreaking. And it's real with parents aren't knowledgeable about this, then they're inadvertently throwing their kids out to the wolves. They're letting media teach their children. We have 50% of 6-year-old girls, 2/3 of 9-year-old girls, 90% of 15-year-old girls modifying their diet because they've already learned that they're not good enough the way they are, because that's what we sell them, because we're trying to make money for the corporations that are selling clothes and, I mean, pretty much anything.
Mm.
We use girls and bodies to sell products because products are more important than people, and we made them more important than people beginning in the 80s.
Looking back at that framework of sexuality and shame and how that manifests in potentially the different genders and the different sexes, and talking about, a young woman's self-image and what choices that leads to in her life, how she spends her money, how she makes decisions, what her family unit looks like, what her professional career looks like, if she is at a higher risk for victimization, for things like sexual violence. All of that is related to this framework that's being set up. And I think, I can remember being a child in those years, and it's so silly, but I tried to explain it to my husband who's from Europe.
Mm,
And I tried to explain to him the power of advertisement in my childhood, how it just had this incredible power over us as kids. And there was a lot of, I think, media absorption for people coming up in my era. There was a lot of watching of television and movies and just absorbing these messages. And one of the examples that I like to use is I can remember so clearly watching McDonald's commercials, and they were so bright, and the lettuce was so crisp, and the tomatoes were so fresh and beautiful. And I was receiving the messages of how healthy this food was, and fresh and good for you. And in my young mind, I just thought, wow, this is health food. This is amazing. This is good for you. Now we know, you shouldn't be going for your burger every day. We know that's not healthy for you. We know that a lot of this messaging was really problematic and frankly manipulative,
yes.
but it set this tone. And I think a lot of us grew up kind of believing what we were
Yes.
told.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It was exploitive, right? It was
Mhm.
to try to talk you into something so that you go and do something, right? Go buy more McDonald's, go buy those clothes, buy those whatever. But one of the things I want to say is that it's a combination of being sold things by media and a dearth not having the actual information to hold it up right next to it. When
Hmm.
we have the actual information, then we critically think, right? So weekend before last, I was watching So You Think You Can Dance with my two granddaughters who are 7 and 4. We were watching on a streaming channel, and the streaming channel now had commercials. It didn't used to, but it does now.
Mm.
I don't like commercials, but I'm not about, I mean, I'm getting rid of a lot of corporate stuff right now. So I'm not about to up that one, And so I
Mm.
thought, okay, we're going to use this as an opportunity to learn what commercials are. So I'm like, so you know what this is? No, this is a commercial. And you know what commercials are? So I told them about how it pays for the show, right? Then I said, commercials try to sell you something, but it's not always clear what they're trying to sell you. So we're going to play a game and see if we can guess what this commercial or that commercial is trying to sell us. That's what we did. We played that game. And this is implanting the information next to the thing, right? When we do that, kids are empowered. They are equipped to think and examine the culture they're in, right? There's good things, there's not good things, and there's everything in between. And we've got to be really good at asking questions. That's what we got to get good at. Well, it's the combination of giving kids so much media without giving them media literacy, the ability to reflect and ask questions, as well as the other things that they might need. They might need to know about, like, is that true? Does everybody look like that? Well, why are
Mm.
bodies so different in our world? Let's talk about that. We talk about heredity. We talk about, you know, what we have access to and, just all kinds of things. When they're given the information that they need, then they can be like, oh, I get what that's trying to do. Okay, so there's a company behind that if you buy that company does really well, right? And so again, we're not necessarily pathologizing, we're just raising the intelligence, the emotional and awareness intelligence of our children so that they can come with critical thinking to their world, which we all need, right?
Yeah.
But when we don't do emotional intelligence education, we don't do sex education or body intelligence education, and we don't do relational education, then kids they're not equipped to question. And inadvertently, they take things hook, line, and sinker. I don't
Mm.
know how not
Yes.
to.
Exactly. They don't know how to ask those curious and critical questions. And I love how you frame that because it's important to understand that these are opportunities to teach them that critical thinking that will translate. But there are certain things that we can't leave also to someone else. And going back to what you've outlined about the history of sexual education in our school systems in the United States over, the majority of our lifetimes, people who are parenting young kids right now, this is the experience they had.
Yes.
They don't necessarily have different tools to use.
No.
And so I love that you've written this book, and I appreciate you're here on a podcast today to talk about how do we learn these new tools? How do we learn to have a different relationship with sexuality that is free of shame and that leans into more truly gifting the educational piece and the respect to who we are as an entire person when we didn't experience that growing up? What's a starting off place for parents? Because as you said, we know the education either isn't there in schools because I think they're right now in our schools, education's undergoing a big shift about, certain topics for sure. And so either the education may not be there at all, or it may be contrary to, scientific evidence,
Right.
or inclusive discussions, things that are really, really important so that all of our kids are learning what they need to know.
Right.
We can't leave it up to someone else. But if you were raised in this culture of shame and of we don't talk about that, what's a way to start relearning your own relationship with your sexual identity and start those important conversations with your
Yeah.
children?
I love that you asked the question that way because it's really a both and. So let's just say you are somebody with children or you're somebody without children, doesn't matter. And when you imagine like being walked in on by a child of yours, by a niece, by a nephew, whatever, do you feel yourself going, or when you imagine a child finding their genitals, do you go, okay? If you feel that anywhere in you, I always tell people, put your hand on your heart and just tell yourself, the people who loved me didn't know how to give me what I needed right then. And so what they inadvertently gave me was their shame, their fear. That's what they gave me. And so that's what I took in. Okay. So I'm going to do two things. If I have children in my life anywhere, or I have my own children, and even if I don't, I'm going to reparent myself by walking myself through the Shameless Parenting book. It's broken down in development in a developmental way. It's birth to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 6, 6 to 8. What are kids curious about? What are their behaviors like? What are their emotional tasks they're instinctively trying to accomplish, right? And then what are the books? What are the top leading books that we have for that age and for kids, and then for the adults in their life? So that kind of explains the meta of what's happening, right? Go through that and imagine that you're reparenting the 2-year-old inside you, the 4-year-old inside you, the 6-year-old inside you. And what would it have been like? And I ask some of these questions in each of the different chapters. What would it have been like if somebody had been there and read this book to you?
Mm.
And ask these questions of you and heal that inner part of you that didn't get it. It's going to feel really, really good. You're going to feel the shame drip off. You're going to feel yourself more liberated. And then if you happen to have kiddos in your life, then I say, if they're older than, say, 6 or 8, go back to the beginning and start at the beginning books and say, I'm getting to learn this now. I wish I had gotten it when I was younger, but we're going to read these books together. Read them together with the kiddos and understand that the toddler through 8 or 9, third grade-ish or so, in there, it's really about emotional intelligence, relational intelligence, and understanding just the basic stuff of the body. So it's things like, what are boundaries? What's a good friend?
Mm.
When am I a good friend? What are the skills that I have? How do I express that I'm unhappy about something? How do I say no? Who owns my body? Do I own my body or do other people own my body? So it's body autonomy. It's all kinds of things. And I give all the top books. You can get them at the library and they're fun to read. You don't even have to know how to talk about it. The book will do it for you. Great pictures, super great authors. They're really fun to read. But that's going to get you through pretty much age 8. And around age 8, I start to talk about media a little bit. I talk about what media literacy is. I start talking about what are the ages that kids get introduced to pornography. How do you deal with that? I start to talk about those things. And then as we get into like 4th grade, so we get into the 8 to 10, 10 to 12, on and up, the issues become more complex. But I walk you right through what they are. Again, I give you the top books, the top websites for parents and for kids. So literally, I always say to parents, you only need to be 2 years ahead of your kid. You don't have to have it all figured out. Just try to stay 2
Mm.
years ahead of them, because if you deal with your own reactivity, calm yourself, love on yourself, then when your kiddos bring these things up, you'll be prepared, right? And you'll be like, oh, what a good question. I partially say that to catch my breath, right? Oh, good question. I try to keep a smile on my face. Okay. I calm myself down. And then I'm like, tell me what exactly about that topic you want to know more about. So I answer your actual question and I don't go off. You know how I can sometimes go off. That's why I won't go off on you. And so you buy yourself a little bit of time, you get a little bit more clarification, and you answer their question, just their question, right? And you say, if you want to know more, we can certainly talk more about it, but I also don't want to overwhelm you. This is something we're going to keep learning as you keep growing. So I always say it's not one conversation, the talk. I've never met anyone where the talk was all they needed or it was helpful enough, right? You want
Yeah.
101-minute conversation. You want to be dropping a tidbit once a month. And really it just comes from listening. What are the kids needing? And being able to do that. So I'm like, take yourself through the book, love on yourself, heal yourself from lots of those shame pieces, and then go on through it again with kiddos. And you will be a different person on the other side. You will be a different relationship with yourself, and your kids will have learned that they can trust you to handle hard conversations that lots of
Mm.
other families aren't. I remember saying to mine as they were growing up, like, you might find out that our family is kind of goofy and weird because we talk about these things, and some families just don't talk about them at all. Like, they never talk about the fact that you've got a penis and you've got a vulva, as if that part of their body is somehow like different, or like, it is a special part of your body, but your nose is really special too. I'm really glad that you can smell wonderful things in your ears, and whatever. Every part of your body has wonderful purposes. This one is no different. But in our family, we absolutely talk about this part of your body because it's a part of your body. So I want you to,
Mm.
you know,
Yeah. And who better to prepare you to have a healthy relationship minus shame than your caregivers that really
absolutely.
are coming at educating you from wanting you to be safe, wanting you to be well educated versus your friends or
Right.
a potential love interest in the future, someone who maybe has a different set of intentions, a different set of backgrounds, and they're only as healed and prepared as they are, as their families help them be. So, this is such an important thing that you could do as parents. And thinking back to what you shared, I wanted to share a quote, if it's all right with you, from your book.
Yes.
And it's the very first part of your book. It's the first thing you say to readers beyond the title. And you ask, why be shameless? Because parenting will kick up your shame.
It will.
And I love starting from that point because it just gets the elephants in the room,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Like you said, you have that standard. Oh, what a good question. Oh, I'm glad you came to me with this. And not only is it acknowledging them, but it's giving you that space between, giving you that moment to regulate yourself. And I love how if you make a habit of it, it can be the thing that brings you into regulation. So then you can just answer the question, like you said, and not go off on a tangent because you yourself are triggered by these old feelings of shame. And I wanted to ask you because it makes me think of another quote from a discussion you had that I thought was really fascinating, looking back at those lectures you were giving to those graduate students. And a question that you asked was, what legacy did you inherit? And is that the legacy you want?
To bring forward, right, exactly. And so after they've written, and you can go on my website, which is just my name, and scroll down halfway and you'll see a thing called the Sexual Reclamation Project, and it's free, and it is the questions that I used to ask my grad students, so you can walk yourself through your own narrative. So it's after they had written that I then invite them to think about, what does this legacy say and how do you feel about it? Is it a legacy you want to hold on to? Are there aspects? What are those aspects? And if there are aspects that you want to change, what is it that you want to move toward? Right? Because I really wanted my students to not just know their narrative, but to think about their narrative continues. Their sexual story will continue. Where do they want it to go? What do they want it to say? We get to be a part of reshaping and shaping and reshaping our story. And we can be an active part of that rather than a passive part of that. And I love helping people be thoughtful and active in crafting the life they mean to live. Right. In my other book, in Sex, God, and the Conservative Church, there's a place where I talk about future retrospective, and I talk about walking people forward until they can imagine that they're on their deathbed. Maybe they're 85, maybe they're 95. If they imagine looking back to this point in their life, maybe they're in their 20s or their 30s, what are the memories that they really want to have? And then what do they need to do to their life right now? So it's a future retrospective, right? What do they need to do in their life right now so that they have those memories of their 20s, their 30s, right? And so that's about crafting the life you mean to live. And I want people to, when the time comes to leave this earth, they feel like I intentionally crafted the life I meant to live. And I'm so grateful for that.
It's a beautiful gift for yourself. And I think when you go about your parenting relationship, if you have children or if you're an educator, right, and you have these young people in your lives and you start to recognize, like you said, when you're teaching this therapeutic experience, that, okay, this is your story, boundary. We need to have that boundary between your story and that of your future clients and patients. And we need to do that with our kids as well, but understand that we're bringing ourselves into that relationship. And if we don't understand our relationship with shame and our sexuality, then we may be influencing them and essentially passing on that, for lack of a better term, that generational curse of shame and sexuality. And if we want a different, like you said, if we look forward and we say, what do I want my children to be experiencing when they're in their 40s, when they're at midlife? How do I want them to reflect back on the first half of their life and be planning for the future? And I think that for it not to be a continuation of the picture that we've lived in, that maybe we wished for a different story, we need to change our approach. But that takes such intention, and it starts with us, not just with telling them what to do.
Right. And that's such an important point, Schaefer, because when we do our work, right, we do our healing, we look at our shame, then we can take our kids further. But we can often not take our children any further than we've gone, healing ourselves, loving ourselves, whatever. We have to have done that work. And it is an investment in you, and it's an investment in all your descendants, right? And the people in your family system. It's also equipping them to deal with the shifts and changes in our own culture, right? So if we drive an economy on selling to people that they're not good enough, it's exploitive, fundamentally exploitive. Well, who's exploiting who in our culture? Like, that's an important thing. That actually has to do with parenting, right? Because if we have more men exploiting women than we have women exploiting men, then we need to teach boys about power abuses. And we need to teach girls about what exploitation can look like and feel like so that they can call it out. And they have to know what they actually want and don't want so that they can recognize that they're trying to be talked into doing something they don't want. They first got to know they don't want that, right? So we have to help them understand the impact of patriarchy on our boys, on our men, and on our girls, on our women, so that they are wise to it, right? And so we teach our boys to pay attention to power. You know, I was telling a story recently of my son is 5 years older than his sister. And one time I asked them, they were sharing a room, and I asked them to clean up their room. And I hear my son say to my daughter, I have a lollipop. How about I give you that lollipop and you clean up my side of the room too? And so I pulled him out of the room and I said, can I ask you something? And he said, yeah. And I said, so if the roles were reversed and your sister said that to you and she was 9 and you were 4, would that feel fair to you as a 4-year-old? And he thought about it and he said, no, it wouldn't actually. And I said, so I need to tell you something. I know that you are a lovely human. You are a loving kid, that you love your sister. But I want you to know that when you do things like that, we call it an abuse of power. You're 5 years older. You're quite a bit bigger. You know, you've been on this earth longer, so you know a lot more. And you can easily manipulate. Now, it is human to want what you want and to try to get it. That is not a bad thing. But it is never okay for us to use our power for us in a way that hurts somebody. That's not just. It's not a form of justice or love for you to try to talk somebody into doing something that wouldn't be okay with you if the shoes were on the other foot. That's an abuse of power. And I will as much as I can, call that out because I don't believe you're doing it intentionally, but I want you to see it and I want you to learn it and know it because you can use your power to serve good, to serve love, to serve justice, or you can use your power to manipulate and hurt. And I know you well enough to know that that's not your heart. You won't ultimately feel good about that. But there's a lot more of that going on with boys and men in our culture. And we'll talk about that as we see it in media. I don't want you to go follow that because I know you'll never be okay with you and it'll make you feel bad about you. And I want you to see what a remarkable human you are. Like, I want you to love you. So I am going to be protective of you in that place. Now, with my daughter, we didn't have to talk about abuse of power as much, but we did need to talk about exploitation and girls that make relationships more important than them and not knowing what they want and don't want and learning to stand up for themselves and these kinds of things. And so it was the way patriarchy was working on each gender in our culture and helping them call out the things that aren't loving and just, right? And so it was an ongoing power was an ongoing conversation. Exploitation was an ongoing conversation. Knowing yourself, an ongoing conversation. And I remember later, I actually wrote a chapter in a book that where I interviewed my kids when they were 25 and 20 about how we did openness, respect, curiosity, and accountability to our power in our home. And my son was talking about how being aware of power meant he felt equipped to use it in ways that advantaged him but didn't hurt other people, like in business or whatever. It helped him in so many different places in ways I hadn't even anticipated because I had never done this in parenting before. I had done it in professional relationships. um, but it's these kinds of things where we're really equipping our kids to be critical thinkers, intentional in crafting their life, and their relationships.
Honestly, Dr. Tina, I think that's the best example of parenting advice that I've ever heard. Like, could we just frame that in gold and put it on the wall here, and have all the texture and the context? Because I really think that's not a conversation and not a perspective that many people are given as an option. And as a woman living in these times, the feeling of oppression and exploitation is often overwhelming. And I think many of us are going through life staying very superficial and just trying to surf above the waves of what we feel is going on. Because if we even think too much about the power imbalances and all the ways that women and girls in our culture and society are being affected by these power struggles, that they're not set up to win because no one had this conversation with these people. No one told them that true power is not in how you can control and make someone submit to you. That's not true power. And you can be much more powerful and much more successful in win-win situations by working with people than by putting them down and climbing over them. And then they're decimated.
Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. There's carnage everywhere. Right. And you're right. That's not ultimately power. That's not ultimately courage. There is so much cowardice in that kind of behavior. Um, but I think about how few parents are actually taught to work with their power in a way
Mm.
that uplifts a child and not squishes their will, right? Of course, they want to wear their Batman jammies. Okay. But maybe they're dirty and they need another pair. You're like, okay, I'm going to give you two others to choose from. I want you to make a choice, but we're going to have to wash Batman. I know it's such a bummer, but Batman will be back tomorrow. But here's a place where you can have choice, right? Learning to work with power in a way that isn't stop, do it. I don't care what you're thinking and feeling, you know, and then they don't feel seen, known, loved, or accepted. They don't feel respected, right?
Hmm.
And children deserve to feel respected too. You model respect, you don't demand respect.
Hmm. Because then they go to college, they leave your home.
That's right.
And if they've been taught, no, you do what you're told because that's respect. And then they go to a party
That's right.
and they're faced with someone exerting power over them in a way that's really dangerous for them.
That's right. That's right.
And they don't know.
Yeah, we see this, right? In girls who have come from authoritarian homes, they don't know exploitation. They are much more likely to get raped and assaulted, blamed, all kinds of things, take it on, all of it. And boys raised in authoritarian homes are much more likely to exploit and to hurt. And then they've been in the boys club, they've been watching heterosexual, often, not that everybody is heterosexual, but heterosexual porn is largely exploitive. It's largely misogynistic, right? It's about using women for your own pleasure. If this is what they're taught and nobody's given them anything else, hasn't taught them about power, hasn't taught them about sexuality, hasn't taught them how you help a relationship grow, like all of the things, then they're doing that and they're wondering why it's not working. Or they find themselves married and their sexual relationship is transactional. She's got it on her list of chores to do. She doesn't seem like she's there. Her heart's not open. Her face isn't, she's not open. And he's taking it from her. It doesn't feel good to him either because he's trying to get intimacy. He actually is lonely, right? But he doesn't know how to do this. He only knows how to take, how to use, how to, right? And I'm often, when you see folks in therapy, often saying, I need you to know we set you up for this. We set you up to have a bad sexual relationship and to have a relationship of push and pull. Can you trust me to work with you in such a way that you learn about collaboration, cooperation, sharing connection and pleasure? So you both come away from any interaction and you've decided ahead of time what's going to feel connecting and what's going to feel pleasurable today. It might not be what we did yesterday or the day before or a month ago, but if in the end you both feel more connected and you shared pleasure, then it's good sex. I don't care what you did.
Hmm. And absent abuse, right? And violence. So,
And exploitation, yes.
and exploitation, absent those circumstances and situations and relationships, it's not too late in your relationship absent those issues. It's not too late to change the dynamic, but it starts with, as you said, sorting out your own sexual identity and your relationship to your sexuality,
Yes.
letting go of shame. And I really appreciate how understanding that starts with, well, yeah, how did my parent look at me if they caught me, masturbating when I was a little kid,
Yeah.
right? Or how did my parent look at me if I wore certain clothes, or if I brought up something, or if they learned I kissed Billy
Mm-hmm.
or Maggie,
Mm-hmm.
right? What was their facial expression? What did they say?
Right.
What was their body language? And if I can sit with that and understand better what formed my relationship and decide, is this the legacy that I want to gift to the people in my life, whether it's my children or my partner, because I think our relationship with our sexuality will also impact
Mm-hmm.
our partners.
Yeah.
And so I think it's so impactful to work on that process of letting go of the shame. And your book is an incredible way to do that. And I will say, I have it on Audible, which is great because I like to listen to things. But I really think it's a great book to have a physical copy of too, to maybe have both. That way you can listen to it. And I think, that's a great way to share books as well with people when it's age appropriate,
Yeah.
to be able to listen to it.
Mm-hmm.
That way it doesn't feel like homework. It's more digestible. But as a parent, I think, and as a person who's being really methodical and kind of scientific about going through the data, looking at the books and treating it almost like, hey, I get to be in Dr. Tina's college course. I get all of this amazing amazing knowledge, it's great to have the physical copy to go through it and say, this is what I want to tackle, so that, like you said, if I'm parenting or if I'm trying to improve my relationship with my partner, or the most important relationship I have, which is with myself, that I'm approaching it systematically so that I'm really growing and improving this relationship.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think I agree. Being able to listen to it is just fun. You can get it in repetitive, and you can be like, okay, I'm getting a little bit more of this or that this time, whatever. But having the actual book, you take that into your library and you're like, can you make sure you order me these books right here, and I'll pick them up in a week. And then go pick up those books, those 2-year-old books or 4-year-old books or 6-year-old books, and read them yourself. And there's a place at the end of every chapter for you to just write any thoughts you have, or notes about what your kids are doing, or whatever. Or like, wow, I wish somebody had read this to me. I love this book. This book I really love, whatever it is. I think being able to sort of care for yourself and care for your family along the way in that physical copy is really great. And then you're stick it. Okay, I've got myself 2 years ahead of my kids. I'm going to put it back on the shelf. I'm going to take it back down in 2 years, and I'm going to get 2 more years ahead of them. You're going to be well equipped to do this. And you don't
Exactly.
figure it out on your own.
In very digestible bits and pieces. And just a little shout out, please support your local library.
Yes.
Like you said.
Yes, please. Absolutely. It's a wonderful resource. Yeah.
Yes,
So,
exactly. We need to support these really important institutions, especially right now.
yeah.
Um, so looking back at your work, I think it's to kind of bring it back to the body, because I think it's helpful. Some of these concepts might seem a bit high and difficult to wrap our hands, our arms around. And as you mentioned earlier, like we love connection as people. We want to put our hands around things. And so thinking back to shame and shame in our sexuality, what is the impact that shame has on a person's
Yeah.
body image as they're just walking around in the world and interpersonally relating?
Right. Yeah. No, that's such a good question. And shame has a profound impact, and sexual shame in particular. So I often like to say to people, kids are finding their genitals somewhere around 11 months, 12 months. They're still in diapers. Okay. They're getting their diaper changed, or they're in the tub, and their hand will land there. And this is about the time they've been figuring out how to grab things. So now the hand's not whacking them like it is the first few months, right? Well, once they make that association, this is an area of their body with an incredible amount of nerve endings. It feels pleasurable to touch, and it's on their own body. It's magnificent. It's wonderful. That day that they find their genitals, what they need is somebody to say, yep, that's your penis. It's a fabulous part of you. And then finish diapering them. Or, yep, that's your vulva. It's a fabulous part of you. And finish getting them out of the bath, whatever. Because they're at a point in their life where you're labeling the world: eyes, nose, ears, right? Shoulders, knees, toes, all of it, right? That's what.
Mm.
But one of the things that's important to understand is, if there wasn't somebody to affirm that, and instead you got their fear, or a yelling, or a face that scared you, or whatever, understand that you did not stop finding your genitals in front of those people until you were probably 4, and you started to finally connect, oh, I need to go to my room or the bathroom because that's what I keep being told, right? Or
Mm.
don't do this here, or whatever you're being told. So it's happened now hundreds of times pre-verbally. So this is trauma to your developing natural sexuality. What most people remember is, I remember getting caught with my friend at 5, or I remember getting shamed touching myself when I was 5 or 6, somewhere in there, because that's when cognitively we can start downloading memories, right? But it's now happened hundreds of times. So then it keeps happening. Now you're trying to go underground. You're trying to not get caught. But meanwhile, you have already made a decision that something is profoundly wrong with you, fundamentally wrong with you. And that then is going to grow, because culture is going to add its own layer on top of that. And then it's going to get an internal critic. going. So what I'd love to do is read, we actually have an operational definition of sexual shame that came out of research that was not done until 2017. First operational definition of sexual shame by a psychologist named Dr. Noel Clark. But I want to read it because it's so poignant. And what I want readers to listen for is how it attacks our intimate relationship to ourselves and our intimate relationship to the people we love the most. Okay. Because if it convinces me I am terrible, I'm not worthwhile, then I'm going to put a mask on, and everybody who loves me, I'm going to think doesn't really love me, because if they knew who I really was, that I'm not good enough, right? So sexual shame is a visceral feeling in my body because it didn't come in cognitively. My left brain, my language brain wasn't even online yet. Into my body, visceral feeling of humiliation and disgust toward one's own body and identity as a sexual being, and a belief of being inferior, unworthy, and a belief of being inferior, unworthy, and abnormal. This feeling can be internalized. In fact, that's where it begins, internalized, but it also manifests in interpersonal relationship. So actually, the first time it happens between me and a caregiver, usually, right? First time I'm shamed. Then it begins to be like, oh, something's wrong with me. And then it happens again. And then it goes inside. And then it happens again, right? Having a negative impact on trust, communication, and physical and emotional intimacy. So those are the core places where we attach when we love somebody, when we care about somebody, familial, friend, partner, right? Sexual shame develops across the lifespan, as I mentioned, in interactions with interpersonal relationships, one's culture and society, as we've talked about, and then creates a subsequent critical self-appraisal. So a critical feedback loop gets going, and this can go on the rest of my life. I am tormented by my thoughts day in and day out. There is also a fear and uncertainty related to one's right to make decisions, including safety decisions related to sexual encounters, along with an internalized judgment toward one's own sexual desire. So there was a book written several years ago by Peggy Ornstein called Girls and Sex. She later wrote one called Boys and Sex, and it's about the impact of media on kids. In Girls and Sex, she said, it was amazing because so many of these girls, 15 to 20-year-olds, seemed so confident and competent in so many areas of their life until they got ready to go out. And then they were putting down 3, 4, and 5 shots of hard liquor because they didn't know if they could keep themselves safe or they had the right to. These kids were not kids who overtly said they were from religious backgrounds, but they had been influenced by abstinence education. And while abstinent education was unrolling, we were unrolling this media that said it didn't matter what we said or did, right? So exploitation and misogyny was on the rise, right? And so you had then this whole system um, coming where we had developed a rape culture. Boys were assaulting and raping because they didn't even know boundary lines. They didn't even know how to seek consent. They weren't all awful. They weren't. And girls didn't know how to create protections for themselves, right? It's not their fault that these things were happening, but we created a system that put kids in jeopardy. And all of that is in that definition. Sexual shame can ruin your ability to do safe and loving attachment, which is core to your happiness. So feeling sexual shame and trying to keep it from developing with those that are coming up is really important to our future happiness and power to craft a life that's meaningful.
I think it's really confusing for a young woman, especially, and for young men on the other side of that coin, because they're in a heterosexual relationship intersecting at this point. From a female perspective, when you're told, and the common discussion now that seems to have gained a lot of momentum in recent weeks and months is that your purpose is to give birth, right? That your value as a woman is to create life. But then there's also a lot of shame and blame around sexuality, and also shame and blame about being a victim of sexual violence. And it's really hard to hold those two things at once. And if your value is in having babies, but sex is a shameful
Yeah,
act. And also, by the way, if you're pregnant and there's a problem with the baby and it's not a viable pregnancy, you could die, but we're going to let you die because we can't, we can't by law treat this problem. I mean, as a young woman, holding all that in your head, how shame isn't what you feel seems an impossible recipe unless you've been given this resilience to question
that's right.
that narrative. I will say, as a parent, and a lot of parents, because we know the statistics on sexual violence in our young lives, a lot of parents were molested by family members, by people in their homes as young children.
Yes.
And so, again, as we've discussed, they're showing up with their own experience, their own feelings and shame when they're changing that diaper and their child touches their genitals for the first time and they're having this response. And I could hear in my mind some people saying, well, how do I as a parent make sure I'm supporting sexual development while also not victimizing my child inadvertently because I was a victim and this is something I've coped with my whole life? And I could see many people feeling difficulty walking that line because, again, their relationship to their sexual identity is one based in shame and not based in education and simply identification of this is a part of your body. What's a good way, would you say, from your perspective of making sure that we can validate your children's bodily autonomy, but also feel confident in ourselves that we're not victimizing them when we're carrying that shame around with
Yeah.
us? How would you respond to a parent with that history?
Yeah, I would say if you grew up in a home that people were not comfortable with sexuality and how do I want to say this? Then that in and of itself, that's enough to seek healing around that. You can do that with a therapist. You can do that with walking through this book and doing it. You can do it with a group of friends. And then if it feels too sticky, go ahead and get it again, a therapist to work with. But if you were assaulted as well and never got a chance to realize it wasn't your fault, to understand how power was abused, blah, blah, blah. You don't have a chance, you haven't had a chance to heal your nervous system around what happened to you. Do please get into therapy, read some books about this, listen to some podcasts about this. We have so much assault and exploitation. We run our country on it. And so there has been so much of it. I've often will say, I don't think that in the last 20 years, I have talked to any woman under 40 who was actively dating in their lifetime before they partnered, if they partnered, that did not have at least one experience they did not want. So when we say it's 40%, I say hogwash. We are closer to 80% of women, right? And again, we're not teaching women about exploitation, and we're not teaching men about exploitation. You know, you can raise a man, you can raise a boy to be aware of power abuses happening all around them. You can be, and you can have so many conversations. I mean, I can remember talking to my son when he looked at porn the first time, or I found it on the computer, you know, and saying, sweetie, this is what's being sold. Were you surprised that penises were that big? You know what I mean? Like and then I'd be like, what you're going to hear from your friendship group is this, because that's what's being said to boys out there, but that's not going to line up with who you are and your values. you're going to someday, I know you well enough to know you're going to someday fall deep and hard for somebody. And you're going to want to have been learning how to treat somebody well. But you're going to get lots of messages that women are there to be used. And that's the culture and I want you to distinguish, because you're writing your sexual story. I already wrote mine. Your sister's going to write hers. How do you want that story to go? Because that story isn't going to just be yours. You know, if you partner someday, your partner's going to be maybe curious about your sexual story. You may have kids someday and they are going to be curious. Well, what did you do, Dad? Right? I want you to think about a story you can be happy with your whole life. I'm not here to judge it. And you're going to make mistakes, and that's fine. But your opportunity here is to learn and write the story that you can be proud of, because you deserve that. Your sexuality is a beautiful part of being human. I want you to feel good about it, right? You can raise kids to not exploit and to be able to see and recognize exploitation, and then make choices that are about love and justice instead. And that's not that they're going to make mistakes, they're gonna, but they're going to be much more likely to be aware.
When you're aware, you can make different choices and you can continue to write the next chapter, and it doesn't have to be based on what just happened.
Hey, exactly, exactly. One of the things, like when you were talking about what happens for women in our culture now, is the absence of the conversation about men and reproduction. There's an incredible book called Ejaculate Responsibly. It came out of a mom blog. It's the 28 reasons why, if we wanted to stop unwanted pregnancies in the US, which we don't, but if we did, we could do it today by making one change. And that is, anybody with a penis who wants to stick it inside a vagina covers it.
Pure and
Yes,
simple.
men always know when they're fertile. Women don't. Men have over-the-counter contraception they can get anywhere. It's very cost effective. They don't have to go to a doctor. They don't have to get a prescription. And the fact that we continue to put this on the shoulders of women is not about it being women's problem. It's about having a misogynistic culture that is trying to silence and reduce the beauty and impact and power of women. That has always been true, because women have, if feminine ways of being or feminine wisdoms have been cultivated in them, they're more collaborative, they're more willing to care about the whole and not just the one. There's so many things there. And we as a culture are threatened, as a patriarchal culture, are threatened by the power and beauty in women. That's what this is about. I mean, hands down, full stop.
And we're aching as women for allies. And I really appreciate how you've highlighted ways, if you have young men in your life, that you can model discussions of bodily autonomy for yourself and for others, of boundaries, of respect, of personhood, that will move that needle, because that's where it starts. I think we're all aching for a way for things to get better, because the system isn't working for anyone. It doesn't work for men or for women.
No, no,
And
because
it
it
starts with
diminishes all of
communication.
their, right? It diminishes all of their experience, and we deserve better. We all deserve better.
Exactly. Well, reading your book, as you've said, whether you have children or whether you're just reparenting yourself, I think is a great starting off point to trying to reclaim that story and change the legacy. Change what you're doing with your sexual identity, your sexual life, and also set an example for the people in your life, your partners, your children. I think it's beautiful and important work you're doing. And I'm so grateful you were able to come on the show today to talk about everything you're doing and your research and how we can really start to impact meaningful change, because it really does need to change, as you've highlighted, for everyone's safety and health.
Yeah.
How can listeners connect with you, Dr. Tina, to get your books, learn more about you, listen to other podcasts? What's the best way for them to reach you?
probably the best way is Instagram. I do have a Substack, but I'm not writing on it yet, but you're welcome to reach out to me there as well. My Instagram is Dr. Tina Shameless, so DRTINA Shameless. And then I have a website and there's some free things to download there. My books you can get on Amazon, but if you are boycotting Amazon like our family is, you can take the book title to any local bookseller and just ask them to order it for you, and they'll be glad to do that for you. If any of your listeners can't afford either book, they can reach out, DM me, and I'm happy to send them a promo link so they can get an audio version of the book. I don't want anybody to not listen because they can't afford to. And then I also want to say, look to your queer community, because those are the people who've been challenging these notions and the impact of these notions on relationships. So that's the place you're going to find where people are saying, I'm not going to make any assumptions what you're into. You tell me, what are you into? They know consent. They've been practicing consent. They've been practicing talking about sexuality and how to have experiences that are really good. So those people are so much of our resources in our community. And I know I focused a lot on heterosexual relationships because that's really where the problems are and where the bad sex is really happening and so on. And they're just because they haven't questioned what's not working enough yet. But your queer community and your local community, man, they are filled with wisdom. And I say turn to them and listen.
This has been an incredible conversation, everyone. Go get Dr. Tina Sellers' books and follow her on social media. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so grateful for your wisdom. And I really hope that people take away positivity from this and can work on that sexual self-image. And it's going to just really bleed into all aspects of your life if you really lean into letting go of shame and accepting yourself fully.
Thank you so much, Shafer. It was a delight having this conversation with you.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to our storytellers for being here. If you have questions for me or for Dr. Tina, please leave them on Instagram, TikTok, under the show notes. We're going to have a quiz. Please answer the question and let us know what your takeaways were from this really impactful, important conversation. I'm sure you have a lot to say and we want to hear about it. Until next time, stay safe and take care. I'll talk to you soon.